Prayers.
Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, send forth, we beseech thee, upon thy servants who bear office in this country, the spirit of charity and justice, that they may be in all things walk before thee with steadfast purpose and a single heart, and faithfully serve in their several offices, through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. O Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Most gracious God, author of all good things, we humbly beseech thee for the Parliament of Barbados, especially the Senate at this time assembled, that thou wouldest be pleased to direct and prosper all their counsels to the advancement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, our most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency the President.
Honourable Senators, I have received communication from Her Excellency the President to the Honourable the Senate, which reads as follows. Her Excellency the President wishes to inform the Honourable the Senate that, on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, under Section 3(1) of the Ombudsman Act, Cap 8A, she proposes to appoint Dr. Nigel Taylor, JPSCM, to the Office of Ombudsman, established by Section 2 of the said Act. Her Excellency further wishes to seek the approval of the Honourable the Senate for the proposed appointment pursuant to Section 3(2) of the said Act, signed by Her Excellency the President, 23rd May 2023.
Announcements by Your Honour.
Announcements. I have the minutes of our meeting held on Friday, 31st March 2023 to be confirmed. Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the confirmation of the minutes of Friday, March 31st, 2023.
The question is that those minutes be confirmed. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meetings the ayes have it. Those minutes are confirmed. We have the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, May 17, 2023 to be deferred. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the minutes of the meeting held on Wednesday, May 17, 2023 be deferred.
The question is that those minutes be deferred. Honourable Senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The next the ayes have it. Those minutes of our meeting on Wednesday, May 17th are deferred. Further announcements in relation to our sitting today. We have indications of excuses for absence from the following senators who are away on business. Senator Crystal Drakes, Senator Gregory Nichols, Senator Monique Tate, Senator Canon Dr. Rogers, Senator Mr. Jerome Walcott.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I am commanded to lay the annual report and audited financial statements of the Fair Trading Commission for the period April 1, 2020 to March 31st, 2021. I'm also commanded to give notice of,
Reports from select committees, questions to ministers, request for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sitting of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of standing orders 45-2 and 22-1 for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that standing orders 45-2 and 22-1 be suspended for the remainder of today's sitting. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it. Those standing orders are accordingly suspended for the remainder of the sitting.
Introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I am commanded to give notice of and to move the first reading of the Water Reuse Bill 2023, Duties, Taxes and Other Payments Exception Bill 2023, and also to give notice of the intent to pass a resolution for an address to be presented to Her Excellency the President approving the proposed appointment of Dr. Nigel Taylor, JP, SCM, to the Office of Ombudsman.
Bills in red first now.
The question is that the Water Reuse Bill 2023 and the Duties, Taxes and Other Payments Exemption Bill 2023 be read the first time. All the senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Those bills are read the first time.
Order number 4, sir. Public business, order number 4.
Public business is now the order of the day.
In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, which has been assigned to Senator Monroe Knight, to move the passing of a resolution that an address be presented to Her Excellency the President approving the proposed appointment of Dr. Nigel Taylor, JP, SCM, to the Office of Ombudsman.
Thank you very
Senator
much.
Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I beg to move the passing of a resolution that an address be presented to Her Excellency the President approving the proposed appointment of Dr. Nigel Taylor, JP, SCM, to the Office of Ombudsman. This is a matter before the Senate, and I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
The question is that this resolution do not pass. All the senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. And since the ayes have it, this resolution is therefore now passed concerning the appointment of the Ombudsman.
Order number 1, sir. Number 1 in the name of Senator Honourable Dr. Monroe Knight to move the second reading of the Public Procurement Amendment Bill 2023. Senator
Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me as I rise to lead the debate on the Public Procurement Amendment Bill 2023. Mr. President, when we talk about the issue of public procurement, what we are essentially talking about are the processes and systems that government uses in all the totality of government, including the state-owned enterprises, in order for it to be able to purchase goods, services, and works in order to fulfill its obligation to provide services to the public. Mr. President, public procurement is not necessarily a sexy subject. You don't hear people telling their children go to university and study public procurement. It is seen as very technical and very dry, and it only makes its way into the public domain once it becomes controversial. Yeah? So we talk about it in the context of companies who may feel that they have been treated unfairly in terms of the awards of contracts, and we see it only in that very small context, again, of the way that government treats to acquiring the, as I said, the services, the goods, and the works that it needs. But I want to suggest, Mr. President, that public procurement is much more than that. Public procurement is actually a fundamental and very critical tool that governments can use in order to shape the nature of the society that it wants to build. It is an essential instrument, an essential policy instrument that can help spur economic growth, inclusion, and participation. Mr. President, if we look at the nature of public procurement, it is estimated that currently government public procurement is worth some 1.6 billion annually. Annually. That's a lot. And we ask ourselves the question of who gets those contracts? Under what conditions are they carrying out those contracts? We ask ourselves as well, Mr. President, how are people eligible to be able to get those contracts? How are we treating to the issues of fairness and transparency? All of those questions have to do with the design of the public procurement framework. And that, Mr. President, is why it is so important for us to pay attention to this whole issue of public procurement, regardless of the fact that sometimes we think it is an esoteric subject. In that context, Mr. President, I am suggesting that public procurement is not to be seen as a benign tool. As I said before, it is extremely critical to how government will shape its own policy agenda. If we take, for instance, the geriatric hospital, Mr. President, and we would have debated that previously in terms of government being able to treat to its elderly by the construction of a new geriatric hospital. And we ask ourselves the question, how are those contracts going to be awarded? And the nature of those contracts. It is not just the construction, Mr. President. There's plumbing, there's electrical that is involved. If you look at the operations, there have to be contracts even for uniforms, Mr. President. There have to be contracts to maintain the grounds. All of that falls within the ambit of what government will need to acquire in terms of services and goods in order to have the construction of the geriatric hospital. So it covers a wide plethora of things and services, as I said before. But the important point, Mr. President, is not only about the fact that public procurement is critical in the context of transparency, which is fundamental, and I'm not going to stress on it because I think that is something that we all appreciate, that having a good, strong, sound public procurement framework says to the Barbadian citizen that the government is paying attention to how it is spending government funds, taxpayers' funds, that it is paying attention to ensuring that people who are bidding for contracts are able to do so fairly, that there is an eligibility criteria that is known, and that the public can have confidence that the contracts that the governments will give will be done in a sound and fair way. And that is the transparency and accountability element, Mr. President, in the context of when we're talking about public procurement. And I would want to suggest that if we even look at Barbados' corruption index, which suggests that Barbados is still the least corrupt country within the Caribbean, and that is as of 2022, based on that corruption index, Mr. President. I want to say that again because oftentimes we get these public debates, but I want to suggest that this is an independent analysis of where Barbados stands. And I bring that up in the context is that certainly one of the indicators of the extent of the corruption has to do with the soundness of the procurement framework, Mr. President. I also want to suggest that current economic thought indicates that a strong, well-crafted, and relevant public procurement policy is critical to a country and an economy that is mission-focused. It is critical to a country and an economy that is mission-focused. Professor Mariama Mazzucato of the University College of London and the Institute for Innovation and Public Procurement, who is now seen as one of the foremost economic thinkers, argues that countries can no longer ignore the big fundamental questions, the big complex questions and challenges that are facing countries. And that is more so particularly for developing countries like ourselves. And when we talk about what are big and complex challenges, we're talking about things like climate change. We're talking about things like health, Mr. President. Those very big things that will take multiple series of interventions and over a long period of time that must be tackled. But again, because of a number of reasons, often countries shy away from doing so, particularly in the context of countries like ours with a 5-year political term. Professor Mazzucato argues that we have to be able to tackle these problems to the ground, and she says that we need to be able to do so by focusing our economy and our policy framework on outcomes, an outcome-oriented framework in order for us to be able to tackle these problems, that we must make sure that we have targeted investment in solutions, a long-term vision, and a governing of the process so that it is done in the public interest. Further, Mr. President, Professor Mazzucato argues that in the context of a mission-focused economy, an economy that is outcome-oriented, that public procurement policy is one of the essential tools that government has at its disposal in order to make sure that it meets, addresses, and tackles those fundamental challenges. Essentially, Professor Mazzucato is saying that a public procurement framework can allow the government to be able to target its policies better in order to achieve particular outcomes. And this is extremely important, Mr. President, in the context of the discussion that we are having. I hope, Mr. President, that the majority of Barbadians would have paid attention on May Day when the social partnership, and the social partnership including the trade unions, the private sector, civil society, and government, announced the Declaration of Mission Barbados, which identified 6 mission-critical challenges facing Barbados and solutions, mission objectives that this country will be focused on in order to address those challenges. And again, Mr. President, this is critical. Remember, I started to talk about Professor Mazzucato and her thinking about the fact that countries need to be mission-focused and the fact that a procurement policy is a critical tool within its arsenal in order to be able to address some of those mission-critical things. In the context of that declaration, Mr. President, the social partnership identified, as I said before, 6 challenges. One was about an unhealthy planet, which talked about the issue of climate change and the general health of our planet and the impact that will have on humanity. The second challenge talked about the need for us to be able to address our social value system and the extent that a changing of that value system was really jeopardizing the social fabric of Barbados. The challenges also identified the issue of water and food security. It identified the health of Barbadians, addressing the issue of NCDs in particular, Mr. President. Importantly, that declaration also identified the challenge of the disenfranchisement of workers and the need to ensure that we create generational wealth, Mr. President. And the sixth challenge that was identified had to do with the digital divide and our lagging in terms of being able to have the technological transformation that is needed. So we have a mission-focused economy, a mission-focused country, that there is consensus around that these are the core challenges. It doesn't mean, Mr. President, that there are not other challenges. What the social partnership has said, that these are the critical challenges, and like I said, the adoption of mission objectives in order to be able to confront those. The question, Mr. President, is how do we address those? What are the tools and the mechanisms that are needed within the context of government policy for us to be able then to achieve those missions? And the intent, Mr. President, is that we develop a monitoring framework in order for us to be able to ensure that we are achieving those missions. But essentially, Mr. President, I want to make a fundamental point. The idea of having a mission-focused economy and having a policy framework, such as a procurement framework that is relevant, is a signal that a government, as I said before, is intent on tackling the complex problems and challenges facing its society. It is for this reason that this government is committed to the undertaking of educational reform, Mr. President. And that, again, is a complex issue. It is not an easy one. It is one that can potentially create political divide and social divide, but we are intent on tackling it, Mr. President. It is for this reason as well, Mr. President, that we are intent on moving ahead with transformation of the agricultural sector, when others had relegated it to the dump of sunset industries. This government is tackling that complex problem. Similarly, like it is tackling the complex problem of health and transformation within the health sector. Complex problems, Mr. President, and using the policy tools that are available in order for us to address those problems, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want, with your permission, to read, if I may, two of those mission objectives, only because they are extremely relevant to the discussion that we are having this morning. Mission 5, or the mission 5, this is the mission objective number 5, says, by 2030, empower and enfranchise all Barbadian workers and families by creating opportunities for ownership and wealth creation that enable Barbadians to take better care of themselves and each other and reduce the rate of poverty by 50%. Mission 6 says, by 2030, transform Barbados to a highly functioning, resilient society with seamless access to services and meaningful digital inclusion for all Barbadians. I've just read those two of the 6 missions, Mr. President. And I read those two, as I said before, because those are key to how government is amending the Public Procurement Act to make sure that we can deliver. And again, as a fundamental point, because very often when we look at government policy, we see it in a silo. We want to be able to look at one particular plank and think that only that particular plank, that only particular piece of legislation or policy will deliver what is needed, without recognizing that, again, given the complexity of the challenges, that we need to be able to do so using a plethora of instruments and policies, Mr. President. One of the amendments in the bill that we are considering this morning, Mr. President, makes provision, and it states clearly at Section 3, it says that for the avoidance of doubt, that the public procurement can occur wholly or partially online. That public procurement can now wholly or partially occur online. This was not previously part of the principal legislation, Mr. President, and it is one of the amendments within the legislation that we are doing under Section 3. And this is significant, Mr. President, in 3 ways. And again, we may not think that the inclusion of provision for having an online facility, an online portal for public procurement is anything significant. But I want to suggest, again, when I spoke to the notion of making sure that we have a relevant, strong, robust public procurement system, that this is one of the fundamental tenets of doing so. It is actually government delivering on its promise to continue to facilitate the ease of doing business by increasingly digitizing access to government services. And Mr. President, I read, if you recall, the last of those mission objectives, Mr. President, if you recall, again, the mission objective about digitizing and increasing access. So we are, again, using this policy tool, this instrument of public procurement, to be able to advance that objective. So within the context of the amendment, we are now indicating that we will have this online facility. And again, Mr. President, again, it is not any small thing. That ability to be able to have your application, your bid online, is also as well, Mr. President, aligned to our manifesto. Our manifesto pledge, again, on creating digital platforms and ensuring that Barbados delivers for all. The manifesto states that the purpose of government operations is not to serve itself, but to make people's lives better, make processes easier and more efficient, and to make policy impactful and valuable. Fundamental, Mr. President. The Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs recently signaled its intention over the next 5 months or so to launch the digital platform that will be used by suppliers in order to be able to bid, to submit their bids to procure for government services. That online platform, Mr. President, is called Bonfire. And it is essentially a major game changer in the context of public procurement. It will replace now the current process of manually having to put all of your documents together, make multiple copies, meet a deadline, Mr. President, by 4:30 in order to be able to submit for a bid. That this amendment allows us to modernize the process, and not only modernize the process, because it also as well, Mr. President, allows us to level the playing field, which is critical. Again, Mr. President, the point that public policy, public procurement policy, is critical in terms of shaping the type of society that we want. By the introduction of Bonfire, Mr. President, what we will have now is the ability for suppliers to go online, to be able to have the ability to take their time to go through their application, to be able when they have questions, Mr. President, to have those questions answered. There will be real-time access, Mr. President, in terms of submission of your documents, being able to have the necessary feedback that wasn't there before. And this caused excessive frustration amongst suppliers and also as well distrust in terms of the government process. So that the bonfire portal now, like I said, Mr. President, creates a significant game changer. What it allows for essentially is that we used to have, Mr. President, and I don't have any scientific proof of this, but I would suggest that within the current system, you would have those that have the ability, that have the resources in order to be able to put together their applications quickly, have staff who can do it for them, put all the documents together, being able to take advantage of the procurement process. So that very often when we talk about monopoly, we think that the system itself is encouraging monopoly by being deliberately given contracts to certain firms, but very often it is the process and systems themselves, because they are not paying attention to the things that will cause a divide, that will cause small and medium suppliers not to be able to critically access the system. This software and this process is essentially seeking to level this by now ensuring, again, as I said before, that people will have the time, the processes, and the support in order to be able to submit their applications through the bonfire portal. And Mr. President, I also want to suggest, because some would say, well, everybody does not have access now to the internet and all of that. I remind Mr. President that it says wholly or partially, so that we make provision for those that might not have that facility to continue to still be able to participate. But the intent, Mr. President, is that over the period now of the 5 months, that we will continue to engage in training, continue to engage all of the relevant stakeholders so that people are brought on board. In fact, it had already happened. The Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs has already been meeting with stakeholders to alert them of the coming on board of the bonfire portal and to ensure that they are aware of the changes and the benefits in the context of what we will do to enhance their experience in public procurement. Additionally, like I said before, Mr. President, you had to be able to meet this deadline that you have to be running behind, because you have to get these papers in by a particular time frame. Now, as I said, small businesses who may not have the resources in front of them all at the same time can now interface with an application that allows them to begin, to stop, to go back, to ask questions, and then when they are able and comfortable, Mr. President, then to be able to submit. And this is fundamental. And this is why I stress, Mr. President, that even though this amendment may seem small, it is fundamentally allowing for us to widen the pool of persons who can bid to supply services. And that, Mr. President, is about enfranchisement. Enfranchisement. That, Mr. President, is about wealth creation. Mission Objective 5, Mr. President. That, Mr. President, is about giving the ability for Barbadians now not to feel that they are going to be somehow unfared in the process or don't have the capacity or the ability to bid as bigger firms do. But at these amendments, in terms of simplifying and modernizing the process, can provide a level of confidence to small and medium-sized suppliers, and not only them, Mr. President, because if I do so, I would say that big suppliers don't have an issue. They too are frustrated with the process. They too are concerned in terms of how bids are being given. But this software will allow us, Mr. President, again, to facilitate the ease of doing business, but more importantly, it allows us as well to be able to monitor the system and to see what is happening as well. Mr. President, within the context of this new software, this new online portal, the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs has signaled that that portal will also include all of the opportunities that are across CARICOM for everyone to see. For everyone to see. And again, this is important because access to information is also critical to how I interface with a process and to my capacity to be able to engage and to bid. So we are, again, deconstructing the process, opening it up, and making sure that it is transparent for everyone in the context of this portal. And again, Mr. President, that is also fundamental when we think about public procurement, its role, government using it as a targeted tool in relation to policy and delivering for all, Mr. President, delivering for all. Another important amendment, Mr. President, to this bill is in relation to the amendment at Section 12, which makes the way for the inclusion of the purpose of public procurement to include the promotion of government socio-economic policies. And again, critical, Mr. President, as I said before, in the context of a mission-focused economy and how the government intends to be able to deliver for everyone, to be fair, to be open, and to be transparent within the process. So that when we talk now about what is the main purpose or objective of government procurement and how the government sees this as an instrument to be able to shape its policy framework, we note, Mr. President, that with that inclusion that we have now critical objectives that will ensure, and Mr. President, I will read now the objectives that we will have with that inclusion of government's ability to promote its socio-economic policies. So that provision would now read that public procurement shall be conducted in a manner that ensures integrity, fairness, transparency, and accountability in procurement proceedings, promotes fair competition among participation by and equal treatment of suppliers, maximizes economy and efficiency, and promotes best value for money, promotes, Mr. President, sustainable development, and, Mr. President, now promotes the ability of government to pursue its socio-economic policies. The fundamental thrust in the context of public procurement, not as a process within itself, not simply about facilitating the purchase of goods, services, and works, but facilitating and shaping a society through how it develops that particular framework. And particularly in the context of a mission-focused economy and country such as ours, then the inclusion of these amendments allow us then to make sure that we build the necessary coherence across our policy framework to be able to achieve and address the complex challenges that we are facing, Mr. President. So that the amendments that are made within the context of this public procurement bill are critical for us to achieve, as I indicated, socio-economic policies. One of those policies, Mr. President, we would have announced as well in the context of our manifesto, our 2018 manifesto, was to ensure that young persons, young people, had the ability also to compete and bid to supply services to government. The manifesto indicated 5%. But, Mr. President, before, we really had no way to be able to monitor that, to be able to make sure that we were actually attracting the young people that were necessary. And so that in the context of these amendments, in the context of the portal, in the context of us being able to say that we will focus this public procurement process on achieving socio-economic policies, we now have a framework by which we can ensure, monitor, and importantly, course correct as necessary if we need to ensure targeting of our policy framework. It allows not only for young persons to be able to signal as a supplier, but also as well, Mr. President, the disabled to be able to signal as a supplier, small businesses, so that we can better be able to see if we are actually delivering on that notion of fairness, of equity, and of participation within the procurement space. And this, Mr. President, again, I want to reiterate, is critical to that notion, again, of mission focus and delivering for all. Mr. President, the amendments to Section 85 and 86 read the supplies register as well, seek to simplify the process, and again, important. And I want us, Mr. President, to know again that these amendments, even though they may seem minor, again, are fundamental to ensuring that people can engage with the process in a more efficient way than they have done previously. And particularly for those that would think that, one, the process is too complex and therefore I do not have the capacity to be able to engage, and therefore it is not for me. So that when we look at the amendments, particularly, Mr. President, at Section 85, in order to be on that register of suppliers, you had to, based on the Principal Act, satisfy 11 provisions that were required there, including one of those provisions that indicated you had to show previous experience in procurement. If I have to show previous experience in procurement to even get on the register, then what does it say? Particularly for small businesses, small want-to-be suppliers. I look at that and I think to myself that I am, before I have even done anything else, being left out of the process. That was what was there before. Now, Mr. President, in the context of these amendments, what we have done is to make such provisions not a requirement to get on the register, but that they can, on the discretion of the Chief Procurement Officer, then request that information when it becomes available and as he or she sees fit. So that upfront, there are just now 5 provisions, which are basic provisions, that then you will have to supply in order to be on the register in relation to this procurement framework. And again, Mr. President, when we talk about facilitating small and medium enterprises, these sorts of provisions are critical. They may mean nothing to most of us. They may seem trite. They may seem small. But for suppliers who want a share, Mr. President, of what I said before was a 1.6 billion procurement framework, then it is critical. The amendments, therefore, Mr. President, as I said before, are about allowing us to now have a more relevant procurement framework that embraces all types of businesses who want to see themselves within the sphere of the public procurement space, It allows for a simplification of the process. It allows for a modernization, Mr. President, of the process. It allows for monitoring of the process in ways that we were not able to do before that are critical. And it allows, importantly, for us to achieve some of those socio-economic objectives that are about transforming our society in the context of using public procurement policy. And that is what a government has to do in the context of addressing the challenges that it is facing, using the available instruments that it has at its disposal in order to be able to treat to those. The Principal Act, Mr. President, I'll give you an example, touches on the issue of green procurement, which is again critical. Because green procurement is about, again, making sure that we address those fundamental challenges. We've talked about it here multiple times in the context of things like climate change. So that when we look at the provision for green procurement, what it says is that companies have to make sure that their practices will fall in line by being friendly to the environment, consider all of the ways that they treat to issues of waste, that they treat to issues of recycling, and all of those things that will make sure that we can maintain the ecological balance that is so important for us. So that again, the issue of public procurement is not just a simple one of facilitating this exchange, but it is, Mr. President, an important part of how government will continue to make sure that we provide and that we deliver, Mr. President. In that context, Mr. President, I believe that the amendments that we have proposed within the context of this amendment bill will go a long way in creating the necessary framework. They will go a long way in ensuring that we can have the participation and increased participation of small businesses, of young people as well, increased confidence, Mr. President, of the market about the framework and their ability to fairly and transparently be able to bid for government contracts and allow the government as well, importantly, to be able to monitor and course correct as needed. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you, and I beg that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Other speakers? If there are none, Senator Dr. Hines.
Good morning, and thank you for acknowledging me, Mr. President. I know that some may think this is a dry area, as Senator Monroe Knight pointed out. Some may think so in truth. But it is an important one. It's one that I think enters public discourse at times in ways that should cause us to think and to ask some questions about what we are doing. So, and as Senator Monroe Knight made clear, the missions, these missions do point to some of the things that perhaps public procurement can facilitate if there is an alignment between procurement and some of the social and other goals that are in place in the country. This should be worthwhile. So you're sort of putting some conditionalities on those who may be bidding for contracts or who are successful in contracts to ensure that in addition to having whatever it is you're seeking fulfilled, there are some other benefits that should be derived from the work. I understand that to be the intention. I hope I understand correctly. Also, this idea of economic enfranchisement is quite a useful one. While I can agree to this, I would also hope that whether we are talking about large private sector entities or small suppliers, that those within the private sector are not hitching their fates, are not considering that they are to amass wealth through public procurement, and that the state is not some kind of entity through which individuals are going to grow rich by means of bidding endlessly for contracts of the state. And one wonders if that is the case already, if that has not been the case, not just in Barbados, but across the Caribbean, where the state has been very critical, not only for employing people, and therefore for the sustenance of much of the population through employment, the creation of jobs, but also the same private sector that may be very concerned at times about the ease of doing business, and rightly so. Rightly so. I'm not trying to demean or diminish these criticisms because they are real and must be taken seriously. But we also need to bear in mind that if we look at Barbados and if we look at this region, some of the things that we may find are that some of the entities that have amassed wealth, that are wealth creators, that are job creators, are able to do so because of their ability to be successful in bidding for government contracts. And when I say that this enters public discourse, it enters public discourse because there is a fear and there is a suspicion, and this is not related to a particular government. I'm talking about something systemic now. There is a suspicion that when it comes to the award of large contracts, the usual suspects are the ones who will feature prominently, and that the scraps will remain for those smaller players who, perhaps because of how the tender is constructed, will not be able, perhaps, to successfully bid for certain things. And there's a suspicion that some of these things are crafted in particular ways so that certain individuals and groups may have access to the public procurement process, to these tenders, to the contracts, to the exclusion of others. And this legislation is important, in my estimation, for dispelling such suspicions by putting in place the mechanisms required that allow for the requisite transparency that can assure persons of why and how things have happened in a particular way. And I do hope that we move more and more in that direction and away from the system that we have in Barbados, and that this is not unique to Barbados. I would say this is a Caribbean governance issue, in which there are particular entities that some view, and it's not just some view, that have been able to build their reputations on the back of contracts from the state, taxpayer-funded contracts. It is my hope that this sort of legislation and any amendments to the legislation shore this up. But while this is my hope, there are still some issues that I believe that we need to address. Because if we look at this amendment, I mentioned the element of socio and economic policies. We know that there is a suppliers register, and there's some updates that are being made to the suppliers register, and then there's the software and the technology. And software and technology, this is really useful. We are moving in this direction of having many things digital. But we have to remember that these are tools and these are not solutions. So we digitize something. This is not necessarily, it can solve some things. It can solve the long waits, for instance, but it doesn't solve some of the other things that I was speaking about. The concern that it is those within a network that are able to have access to particular contracts, that they might know about them early for some reason that has nothing to do with this legislation or the technology. The concern, the suspicion that is very real and that remains in this country, that persons or entities who may be funding certain political activities may have an in to the tendering process. Why do people have this suspicion? There's a reason that this suspicion exists, and that is because we do not know how political campaigns are financed from either side. And as I said, this is not a criticism of a particular government for those that may start to get a little bit itchy or something. We are talking about in general, because governments change, and each time they change, the suspicions remain. The suspicions remain. So, technology is not going to solve that. Having a register and having an online mechanism for registering and bidding, etc., is not going to address these. So how do we get to some of these problematic elements related to public procurement that exist in Barbados, and I'm going to say across the region, but we're dealing with Barbados today. And the reason I keep saying across the region, and the reason I keep saying that this is not about a particular government, is because this is about our manners of governance, not about the particular institutions, the mechanisms, the technologies, but some of the cultural factors, the political culture that exists, that we have to find ways to break away from, so that persons are confident that they can indeed bid, and that they will have a real chance, and that this is not something that has already been pre-decided through some backdoor mechanisms. Technology is not going to address that. And one of the ones that comes to mind recently, and I'm going to take the risk of bringing it here, is that in 2021, there was a particular issue that was in the news cycle in Barbados and across the region that had to do with the procurement of some vaccinations during the pandemic. And thankfully, what we learned was that no public funds, no taxpayer funds were involved in this situation, I'm going to call it. However, and it was an emergency situation, and because it is an emergency situation, one can understand that certain things may pertain that might not pertain if it were not an emergency. However, one of the things that stood out to me was the statement that we received from a public official that indicated that due diligence was followed in this quest to seek 1 million vaccinations. And despite due diligence being followed, we ended up, Barbados ended up in an embarrassing situation surrounding this effort to procure vaccinations for the public. Other countries were in a more difficult situation because they could not say that taxpayer funds were not used. But it still was an embarrassing one. And questions remain as to how some of the things that emerged, such as letters on letterhead from the government of Barbados authorizing certain transactions, were able to be provided to particular individuals and entities without the minister knowing anything. Because that is what I read, and that is what I heard. So although we have these mechanisms in place to regularize these processes, to bring transparency, we have to make sure that these are one-offs. And in fact, not that they're just one-offs, that they're none-offs. That this is an anomaly, and this is not something that will come to the public attention. And I'm not saying that it will come to, this is something that will not come to the public attention because it is covered up. It is something that will not occur. It will not occur, these sorts of irregularities. And if I go back to my point about the suspicion that exists within our society, is that when we look at who were the players involved, we are talking again about persons whose names tend to be called as the usual suspects when it comes to other areas of public procurement. So if it is that we are going to get rid of these suspicions, that we are going to move in the direction of enfranchisement, that people are to be confident that when they use this online platform, that when they're registered, that when they bid, they're going to be treated appropriately and fairly, and they will have a chance to earn part of their income or to support part of what their company does through public procurement. If we are supposed to engender this confidence in persons, we have to guard against these kinds of very embarrassing and irregular, in my estimation, irregular circumstances that as yet we have not received firm answers for. How come a minister is not aware, was not at the time aware of this? So, Mr. President, while I do not take any issue with this, I do want to encourage us to think beyond the technology, think beyond the register, and really ensure that confidence is instilled in our society, that this legislation, that the arrangements that it asks for are followed appropriately, so that public procurement does not become one of these political footballs that is kicked around government after government with endless suspicions about the wealth of certain individuals and groups being amassed out of taxpayer funds. And no matter which government is in power, the same thing will persist. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Haynes. Any other speakers? If not, I'll ask Senator Dr. Monroe Knight to wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to agree with Senator Dr. Christina Haynes about the complexity of the issue, the fact that it is not an issue that is about a country. It is something that is systemic across political systems. And I also want to agree with her, as well with Senator Dr. Christina Haynes, that the issue of trust and the issue of culture as it relates to how the political system operates is one that we also have to address. But I would suggest, Mr. President, that we can also agree that this is not something that is going to change overnight. That because of its complexity, it is something that we are going to have a number or a series of interventions on as we try to tackle and address the issue. I would also want to suggest, Mr. President, that it is unlikely that we may ever have the possibility that there will be no incidences of irregularity or fraud. But what we would have to do is ensure that the processes and the systems that we have in place, either one through the legal system, as has happened, will lead to a conviction of those that have been so accused and found guilty of fraud and certain levels of corruption, or that we will be able to have a system that allows us to effectively to be able to mitigate. And that is what, in the context of this amendment, these amendments to the Procurement Act, is attempting to be able to do. Mr. President, I also want to suggest as well, and to give an example. Last year, this is around the end of the year, there was circulating on social media a letter pretending, actually not a letter, an email pretending to come from the Division of Culture that had the email address of one of the members of staff and the signature of one of the members of staff of Culture. Anybody looking at it would say that is real. The levels at which people go now to copy and replicate things, they're at a different level, and all now of the AIs and all the different technological things that we have now will mean that governments now have to be able to do better in terms of its cybersecurity and all of those things to prevent that. But there are those that will continue to attempt to do it. But to say that we will be able to prevent it altogether, to say that people will not go to sophisticated means, Mr. President, in order to tamper with the system, Mr. President, we cannot guarantee that. I don't know that anybody can guarantee that will happen. As I said before, what this Procurement Act, what the amendments are attempting to do, is to at least provide a framework. And while technology cannot necessarily answer all of the questions, particularly the cultural questions, what it can do is to provide some critical solutions that open up the system, make it wider, make it more inclusive, make it more transparent, make it more fair. Mr. President, it is a journey of process. And as I said, the attempt is that government will have to use the full arsenal of tools that it has at its availability in order to address the missions that it is focused on. And this Public Procurement Amendment Act is but one, Mr. President. Mr. President, I beg that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg that Your Honour do now leave the chamber and the chamber dissolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I do beg that Clause 1 stand part.
The question is that Clause 1 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg that Clause 2 stand part.
The question is that Clause 2 do now stand part. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
I beg that Clause 3 stand part.
The question is that Clause 3 do now stand part. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Madam Chair, I beg that Clause 4 stand part.
The question is that Clause 4 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 5.
Madam Chair, I beg that Clause 5 stand part.
Question is that Clause 5 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. And those against, please say no.
Clause 6.
The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I do not beg that Clause 6 stand part.
The question is that Clause 6 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. All honourable senators against please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 7.
Beg that Clause 7 stand part.
The question is that Clause 7 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour kindly say aye? And will those against kindly say no? The ayes have it.
Clause 8.
Madam Chair, I do now beg that Clause 8 stand part.
The question is that Clause 8 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour please say aye. And those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Public Procurement Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Public Procurement Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Order number 2, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Three Houses Spring Management and Control Bill 2023.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg your permission to treat to items number 2 and 3 on the order paper as a cognate debate, please.
The question is that we treat item number 2, which is the Three Houses spring related matter and an amendment to the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation Act in relation to empowering the corporation to act as the management authority for the Three Houses Spring as one debate. That is, to be clear, the second reading speeches will deal with the issues arising from the 2 amendments, but of course, the votes will be taken separately as 2 separate items. So to the extent that they are related issues, I put the question is, honourable senators agree that items number 2 and 3 be taken as a cognate debate. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. We will proceed accordingly. Under comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think we are all here today after 2 days of some amount of rain, some flooding activity to the extent that we had a downpour for a period of time. And this is a conversation, Mr. President, today only insofar as we are also simultaneously in an extended period of drought. And as a consequence, we have been advised by the entity with responsibility for management of the nation's water supply, the Barbados Water Authority, that there are drought restrictions and water use restrictions in place as a consequence of the conditions that we're facing and the projections from the Barbados Meteorological Service for what we are expecting up ahead in the coming months. Certainly at last report that I had access to, the expectation is that there would be an extended period of drought and that there would be very few instances that were intermittent of rainfall, Mr. President. And so this is a conversation that is very current in the country at this time. And so therefore, Mr. President, a resolution specifically speaking to the matters that affect farmers who are dependent on a spring, its flow, and the treatment of the reservoir that is Browns Pond downstream from Three Houses Spring is a contemporary question as well, because one of the natural consequences of drought conditions and water restrictions, Mr. President, is that you have every day in the newspaper, not just the local newspapers, but regional newspapers, because the rain, if it's not falling in Barbados, it's not falling in anywhere in the Eastern Caribbean by extension. But the region as a whole is reporting every single day challenges with drought-like conditions affecting yields of crops for farmers as a consequence of the limited access to water resources to irrigate crops. And so, Mr. President, this particular piece of legislation, in the first instance, Order Number 2, which speaks to the Three Houses Spring Management and Control Bill, and then the item at number 3 on the order paper, Mr. President, which is the amendment, and we're therefore treating to it as a cognate debate, allowing the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation to effect the management system that is now being introduced by the previous legislation to which I referred previously, is therefore important. And so it is on that basis that I would wish to make 2 points today. And my presentation will speak first about the policy framework that gave rise to the legislative framework that we are now presented with today. And then in the second incarnation, I will speak to that legislative framework itself and what it seeks to accomplish in the course of what we are describing. Mr. President, there are those who are from rural communities and have historically, and their ancestral roots before them have been grounded in certain communities and certain practices. Three Houses Spring, for those of us who are not from the St. Philip area, and the Three Houses area, for those who are not from the St. Philip area, is an area that we are accustomed to going to for picnics in the park. That is the extent of the knowledge of many of us as Barbadians of the Three Houses area. We have heard all our lives growing up in Barbados about the importance of Three Houses Spring itself, however. And so in the course of the last few years, Mr. President, you have heard the Minister with responsibility for agriculture speaking on the various issues that have confronted farmers in this country, whether it was an issue of pricing, whether it was an issue of the inputs that go into farming, specifically feed prices that then affect the consumers on the other hand, whether it is access to irrigation, whether it is diversification of the agricultural sector, whether it is access to land and land lease resources that have been provided, whether it is empowerment and enfranchisement and making agriculture attractive in particular to the younger generations. We have heard the minister and by extension, the ministry and all of the related agencies responsible for agriculture speaking about the importance of a range of interventions necessary for the protection of agriculture as a sector and farmers as people who are part of the community. This resolution, Mr. President, seeks to do both. It protects agriculture on the one hand, promotes its development. It provides access to irrigation resources for those who are in the area, and in so doing, it ensures that the farmers who are described in this legislation, the farmers that are referred to and therefore described in this legislation as the riparian owners. The riparian owners. And for those of us who, I don't know if there are those who have, I'm not a big TV person, but for those of you who used to watch Keeping Up appearances, Miss Bucket, AKA Miss Bouquet, every time I hear the term riparian, I think of Miss Bouquet, because I would always remember her having picnics along the riverbanks and wanting to have all of these people coming along with her. So when I heard the presentation on this particular item, I remembered Miss Bouquet, Miss Bucket, and who would talk about what that meant. And so here we are now, Mr. President, with the persons who along the banks of this spring flowing down into Brown Pond have ownership over the land and therefore the resources on the land and therefore the tributary that comes all the way down from Three Houses and ends at Brown Pond. Those persons along the way are those to whom we are referring when we describe them as the riparian owners. And so what this bill seeks to do is to protect the acreage of land earmarked and being used presently for agricultural production in this area, and the farmers who have been farming that land, those lands, for generations. Mr. President, this legislation also attempts to address something that is important in the context of our own law reform and legislative reform. This, if you listened to the honourable member in the other place who is a minister with responsibility for agriculture, he talks about the legislation being over 300 years old. I don't know, Mr. President, if there is any piece of legislation, a single piece of legislation, and he may be right when he said it, that is this old. We have other instances of legislation dating back to the 1920s, 1930s. This one dates back to the 18th century. It is an extended period of time that exists where this arrangement was in place, even prior, long before independence. And so, Mr. President, what the legislation is attempting to do now is to treat to the contemporary issues facing farmers and the sector in the area, while simultaneously bringing up to speed a piece of legislation that dates back quite an extended period of time. What we have here now, Mr. President, is legislation that was first enacted in 1713. That's how far back this legislation goes. 1713, based on what we have been advised by the Ministry of Agriculture. 1713 is not 2 days or 2 weeks, it's a long time, Mr. President. And so you have before us, we have before us, not you, we have before us a number of policy considerations that are now incorporated in the legislation. And I want to begin to go through what some of those things are, Mr. President. One, it defines what Three Houses Spring is to be defined as, Mr. President, and it gives a very clear indication of that definition. Then it goes on, Mr. President, to speak about how that spring is to be used. And it says that it is supposed to treat to how long, 8 and 40 hours, you are able to dam the spring for the purposes that you are allowed to dam the spring. And it gives a management system assigned to the entity known as the BADMC. Mr. President, so here is what we are going to be proposing. The BADMC, in order number 3, is to have the authority to manage and control the use of the spring. In the following ways, it will outline what that policy objective is. 1, the realignment of the spring, the persons entitled to use the spring, the terms on which they're allowed to use the spring, and how to settle disputes, Mr. President, around how the spring is being used. We have a number of things, therefore, outlined in the legislation that I want to speak to, Mr. President, and those things will come in a few minutes. But first, let me say that this is a piece of legislation that was subjected to extensive consultations over an extended period of time. There were consultations with the stakeholders who are the owners of land in the community. There were consultations with farmers, those who were invited, and they were all invited, and those who were present and made the time on more than one occasion, Mr. President. There were visits being made by the team from the Ministry of Agriculture. And you heard, Mr. President, the honourable member in the other place responsible for the Ministry of Agriculture, who spoke about even from so far back as this government was in opposition, going to the area and hearing from the people what their concerns were, what mischief they felt needed to be corrected, and how the situation at the spring was affecting them in terms of their livelihoods and how it was affecting their crops as a result of the conditions. So, Mr. President, imagine now we're in a drought, the rain isn't falling all the time, the spring ordinarily would be flowing down into Browns Pond, and now you have issues, Mr. President, where you are trying to navigate what is supposed to happen in this area, Mr. President, when the spring is fully populated? What happens with Browns Pond? How can people downstream of the spring not have access to water? That becomes even more important at this time. So the consultations that I referred to took place. You have the inputs of the stakeholders, namely the farmers and those who are from the community. And you have a body of legislation that is now being updated in the new legislation. What does that legislation contain, Mr. President? If you were to go to the legislation itself, first of all, it speaks about how this is to be administered, how it is to be applied, and it is meant to be read in tandem with two additional pieces of legislation at least. Those additional pieces of legislation will be the Underground Water Control Act, CAP 283, and the Barbados Water Authority Act, CAP 274. Mr. President, the BADMC, Order number 3, is then being given the authority to manage and control the spring in a way that ensures fairness and equity for all of the persons who are connected to the spring. There are also emergency measures, Mr. President, and it was interesting to listen to at least two of the honourable members in the other place speak about what fairness and equity was being described as. You heard them describing fairness and equity in terms of individual landowners attempting to take control over sections of the spring, damming it for their own recreational purposes, and therefore denying those downstream of the spring access to water coming from the spring. You heard in the other place, Mr. President, from the members in particular who represent the area of instances where landowners upstream of Browns Pond were therefore engaging in practices that either resulted in pollution of the spring and therefore Browns Pond as a consequence, and that had a deleterious impact on the opportunities that are now being developed also under the Ministry of Agriculture for the utilization of Brown Pond for shrimp farming as a new nascent industry in Barbados. Those are some of the issues that you saw and you heard coming from the representatives who live and have always lived and have represented those in the community. And so fairness and equity was inbuilt into the consultations with those who are dependent on access to the area, those who were concerned that if I am upstream from the pond, if I'm high up on the spring, I do not have the right to ensure access for myself, but not for others, Mr. President. And if we were to go back to the discussion that we have had on every single piece of legislation in this honourable chamber, Mr. President, we have had this conversation as it relates to noise management and noise pollution with flying kites with bulls at night. We've spoken about it in terms of management of the PSV sector. We've talked about it in terms of transport and management of the roads. The notion of fairness and equity as a part of our society, consideration for others, is something that we are continuously coming to this honourable chamber to legislate because individuals are functioning in their own right for their own purpose and in their own interests at the expense of others and with no due regard to others. And so there's a notion of entitlement. I am entitled to serve my own purpose. I am entitled to do as I please for me, and I am not interested in anybody else. That cannot be the Barbados that we live in, Mr. President. And so while it is for us in here an exercise in legislative management and legislative reform, that is fine. But what we are really talking about is if people and a nation living as a community with due regard for others. That is also what we are talking about, Mr. President. And it was interesting for me to hear in some of the other conversations and in an earlier contribution you heard about, well, you know, the legislation on its own as it is written doesn't solve the problem of what government is going to do. I agree, Mr. President. There are times where government's behavior may need to change, and I agree with that. There are times where we need to inspire the confidence of the people by making changes in how we do what we do. Those things are all true, Mr. President, but let us also match that with we, the people of Barbados, not just complaining or being concerned about what others are doing, but being a part of the solution. And I find myself having to say this identical thing in almost every bill that we bring here. If, Mr. President, on issues relating to contracting and procurement and so on, Barbadians themselves are willing to be a part of the solution, and not just by saying, go to Parliament and make the changes, not just by saying, go to Parliament and go to Cabinet and hold government accountable. But I hope that you understand that when you pick up the phone and call somebody and ask them to do a favor because you have access, that also may not be fair or equitable to somebody else. I hope we understand that when we're having difficulties and we want somebody to give us something without us having worked for it, that is also part of the problem, Mr. President. So let us start by changing us, and everything else will change along with us, because Prime Minister has a saying, and she says it takes two hands to clap. And whether it is big or small, we have to be part of the solution and not just the identification of the problem when it is somebody else other than us. Mr. President, we have to be a part of the change in this society that we want to see. So when we start talking about fairness and equity in legislation with a spring and a pond affecting farmers and livelihoods, we may want to have beautiful places for recreation on our land because we have bought space that allows for us to do that, and that is fine, we're entitled to that. But we're not entitled to do it at the expense of someone else, because we are all part of the same Barbados and part of the same community, and it is a mindset that has to be addressed, and it has to be addressed aggressively in this country, Mr. President. These pieces of legislation are necessary, yes, but change is also necessary to begin with us. And so we have, in this instance, Mr. President, the BADMC being empowered to respond to issues of the management of how the spring is being treated, and in so doing, because there are so many private properties along the spring, you now have to give notice. And the BADMC is required now to give 3 days notice that they intend to come in and to look at what is happening with a given area along the spring. What does that mean, Mr. President? That you have an entity being empowered to manage human behavior, minimize the impact of human selfishness or self-servingness. You have a situation, Mr. President, where the BADMC is now empowered to come in and give 3 days notice so that the 8-inch pipes, for example, that the Honourable Member in the other place spoke about that are damming or penetrating the spring are no longer in effect, except insofar as it is irrelevant in the legislation itself. These are the things that I believe the Ministry of Agriculture is attempting to navigate. But, Mr. President, this is not to stop anyone, whether they have been a part of the problem or part of the solution. This is not to stop anyone from being able to use the spring. This is being able to ensure that everyone has access to the spring and not just some, Mr. President. And so farmers in places like River Plantation, where this is predominantly going to be set anchored, are then therefore covered under the legislation. So BADMC has, for example, tenants and lessees who are able to lease land from the BADMC. They are being permitted in this legislation to extract water from Browns Pond for very specific purposes. Irrigation purposes, that's what is specific. Irrigation purposes, because this is an agricultural measure. And because, Mr. President, as is the case with all legislation which attempts to regulate human behavior and human conduct and ensure that communities live as part of a genuine community and that there are shared natural resources, there are penalties for failing to comply with the legislation. There's prohibited conduct in the legislation, Mr. President, and there is a summary fine on conviction of $25,000 or 2 years imprisonment or both in the event that a person is found guilty of an offense for which the spring is being used and is not supposed to be used. And then there are the issues of how we deal with officers of the BADMC. Mr. President, I am perpetually in awe of those persons who serve on the front line every day and who go into circumstances that sometimes can be problematic for them. We're not just talking about police officers who are going to confront crime. We're not just talking, Mr. President, about those persons who work in health facilities at all. We have, Mr. President, you remember a few years ago, a photographer from a local newspaper was responding on his job and going onto a site to report on a story in the course of conducting his ordinary business, and he lost his life, Mr. President, because he was confronted with hostility. And so we are dealing with officers who, in the course of their normal duties, have to go into circumstances on properties with individuals who can at times present levels of hostility that can pose a danger to life and limb. And so there has to be a protection afforded to those persons. And the BADMC extension officers are no different. Mr. President, we go and travel all over the world, maybe not as often as some of us in here every other week, and they're shaking their head, Mr. President, I have not called the name, but certain persons, neither will you. And neither will I. But we travel all over the world, Mr. President, and when we look at the screens or we look at the walls in airports, for example, we see strong, robust language. No assault, disrespect, or abuse of officers in this facility will be tolerated. And then they go on to say what will happen in the event of. And we comply, Mr. President, because once we over in a way, we follow the law to the letter. But it's only when we hear that is a different story. So the BADMC officers are also a part of those persons who work on the road and have to go into situations that sometimes can be protected. And the Ministry of Education, of Agriculture, and by extension, the government of Barbados is saying these are persons who are to be protected in the course of the normal conduct of their duties, and any person who is found guilty of an offense against a BADMC officer operating within the confines of the law is guilty to summary conviction or a fine of $1,000. Now, there is a mechanism for oversight, Mr. President, and the Oversight Committee is proposed for establishment, and that is outlined at Clause 311, and that has, for instance, Mr. President, how that is meant to be established. And therefore, you have the role of the various persons who are assigned, in particular, the general manager of the Barbados Water Authority, and you have the representative from the BADMC, as well as the owners of the riparian rights in the area. The committee, therefore, will now meet and make the arrangements for how it is going to function, and it will make rules accordingly. But here, Mr. President, is where we then become even more proactive in terms of introducing the settlement of disputes. We are not, by nature, Mr. President, a litigious society. We don't run and go to court with everything, as far as I know, but I see a lawyer in the room who may be benefiting from any litigious type behavior, so that may be the case. But typically, we want to quarrel or we want to find a way to resolve things, but it's not always our first course of action. And so in this instance, Mr. President, there is a settlement of disputes that allows for the mechanism, first by the Oversight Committee, to be able to engage, to resolve whatever the issues are. And if you don't resolve whatever the issues are at that level, you have recourse all the way up to the High Court, Mr. President. And so within a 3-day period or so of receiving a concern and having it raised, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture will then forward to the General Manager of the Barbados Water Authority, who's the chairman of the committee, what the issue is and have it taken from there. Now, there are a number of regulations, and I'm going to list what those 7 regulations will come and look like. The regulations will include the following things. 1, the type, size, and specifications of pipes and pumps to be used for the abstraction of water from the spring, the use of water from the spring and the prioritization of its use, the rate of abstraction of water from the spring, the rates and charges for use of water from the spring, the exemption of persons from the payment of rates and charges for the use of water from the spring, special rates or charges payable in respect of the use of water, and finally, giving effect to the provisions more generally of what the bill has outlined. And so we have a number of regulations I have just spoken about. They are subject to negative resolution, but also the minister is expected to make penalties to a maximum of $1,000 or a minimum period of imprisonment for 18 months. There are also schedules to the bill, 3 of them in particular. The first schedule describes the bill itself, The second schedule shows where the spring is supposed to be in terms of its alignment, and the third schedule gives a list of who the riparian owners are, and you will see that at third schedule riparian captioned riparian owners section 2, and a list who they are as it stands now, Mr. President. That is all appended to the bill in the respective schedules. Now, Mr. President, the Minister of Agriculture has advised that this is just being done in phase 1 at this time. The expectation, Mr. President, is that there is supposed to be further work further down the spring, and that is going to take place in phase 2. He spoke in great detail about what those phases would look like, and he has outlined, and he wants to be clear that while his presentation in the other place spoke about what was being done presently, and he did give an indication about what was proposed to be done in subsequent phases, that they are committed to ensuring that they continue to engage within the mechanisms provided for in the bill itself and in the provisions governing the BADMC with those persons who are relevant stakeholders in the area. Mr. President, this is a government that has been very clear, as I close, that people must matter. Engagement with people must matter. We didn't just start walking about talking to Bajans last week, I know that there are some who are now getting to know what Bajans have to say, and they didn't know before, but this is a government that was walking around this country and talking to people in a rubbing shoulders campaign from in opposition. This is a government, Mr. President, that the Honourable Prime Minister has said was able to respond to the challenges of the nation immediately upon assumption of office, because it was walking around before we came to office in opposition for over a year, speaking to the concerns of people, mapping out policy, and came to government ready and prepared to serve, to face and fix the problems of the nation. That is what we came to government to do. We started to do it in opposition, Mr. President, but we didn't stop there. We have continued, Mr. President, with rubbing shoulders all throughout the last 5 years since 2018 in this country, Mr. President. What people see as Parish Speaks is a continuation of the formal component of rubbing shoulders. But what you don't see, Mr. President, highlighted in the newspapers or highlighted in the press elsewhere, is that before any parish speaks, you usually would have the Prime Minister herself, the Deputy Prime Minister herself, members of Parliament themselves, and all of the officials of the ministries that they lead that are typically representative of the issues that nationals and citizens of Barbados want to raise put on the table. The most problematic areas in a constituency, Mr. President, are guaranteed to have a walkabout with the Prime Minister. We don't have to publicize it. We don't have to call the press to say, come and do that. We do that every single month, Mr. President, led by the Prime Minister. But that is not all. The members of Parliament themselves, on a weekly basis, you have different clinic days where they're going to be in their office, but you also have days, Mr. President, where they're on the ground in the communities. That is required. And that is the reason why you will hear the Minister of Agriculture speaking not anecdotally, not as a policy measure, purely as a minister from the remoteness of his office elsewhere in Graham Hall, but he is speaking as a person who is immersed in his community, who listens and hears the concerns of those to whom he is accountable. That is what this government is about. And so this legislation and every other piece of legislation that is relevant to community development in this country and sectoral development in this country, Mr. President, is driven by a government that listens and engages and hears what people involved in the sector want to see as a policy intervention because of the challenges that they are facing. And I am confident that this legislation, Mr. President, the Three Houses Spring Management and Control Bill, accompanied by the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation Amendment Bill, will treat to the issues that have been raised by those residents of the St. Philip area and all of the adjoining areas that are serviced by this spring, Mr. President, and who will benefit from the engagement with agricultural and water officials in the interest of protecting their livelihoods and ensuring that they are able to feed the nation. And with these words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. The speakers. Senator Malado.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for recognizing me. The issue of water usage in Barbados is a subject near and dear to my heart. And on this day, I'll take the opportunity to speak to it, as what we're doing at Three Houses certainly is part of a broader matter that needs to be addressed. I've often heard Barbados referred to as a water-scarce nation. But in fact, when I do some searching to find out if that is in fact so, I ended up at the United Nations, who describe us as, and I shall quote, Barbados ranks among the top 10 most water-stressed countries in the world. And this is given the limited availability of surface water. The country is almost entirely dependent on groundwater from aquifer sources. It goes on to talk about the consequential changes in precipitation patterns and rise in sea levels, which can cause saline intrusion into the aquifer, Mr. President. But when we talk about water scarcity, I went looking a little bit further to try and understand this, because this is where our agriculture depends on it. I found that really water scarcity is a broad term which can be broken down into two areas. One, physical water scarcity, and two, economic water scarcity. When I looked a bit further, Mr. President, I needed to try to understand if in fact Barbados was suffering from a physical water scarcity. So how would I do that? I am not an engineer and an expert, so I did ask some questions and learn. And I learned that on average in Barbados, we have about 50 inches of rain a year. But that didn't mean a whole lot to me, because I only knew how big Barbados was, and I knew it in square miles, 166 square miles. And then I also knew that the Barbados Water Authority tells us that they pump about 40 million gallons. So I had a problem per day. Thank you. I had a problem because I had inches of rainfall, I had square miles of land area, and I had gallons of pumping. So I had to go and look a little further to try to figure this one out. And Mr. President, here's what I did figure out. The desalination capacity from down in the Spring Garden area is about 7.5 million US gallons per day. So everything else that we use in water comes from rainfall, comes from our aquifer. Barbados being 166 square miles, and may I refer to my notes with your permission, Mr. President, 166 square miles equates to 640 acres per square mile. And there's 43,560 square feet in an acre. And there's 144 inches in a square foot. I won't go on and on and on, but just to tell you that on average in Barbados, we get about 1.4 billion gallons of water falling on our 166 square miles. Why is that relevant? Because if we go back to the Barbados Water Authority's use of 40 million gallons that they pump per day, you will find that we actually only use, from a physical scarcity point of view, Mr. President, less than 10% of the rainfall that falls on Barbados. 90% of the rainfall that falls on Barbados, we don't use at all. I know we can go one step further. We've heard in many other places, I've seen in the media, I've heard engineers and knowledgeable people talk about it. I've heard the Barbados Water Authority officials talk about it. They describe their water between revenue water and non-revenue water. Very interesting thing, you know. It's kind of like they got revenue bread on the shelf in the shop and they got non-revenue bread. I guess the non-revenue bread is the one that goes out without getting paid for. But we have an issue, as we know, that although we are pumping 40 million gallons of water per day, we are only getting paid for about 20 million gallons. So there's about a 50% non-revenue water. So I've described to you the fact that 10 times more rain falls on Barbados, water falls on Barbados per day, per year, Mr. President, than we actually use. But we are very lucky in Barbados because God has given us, other than in the Scotland district, a very interesting geology. We have about 300 feet of coral stone, and this water falls and it percolates through this coral stone and it gets into this aquifer. Unless, of course, it runs into the sea, in which case it never gets into the aquifer at all. So the conclusion, though, from this, what this tells us, the history of our water, how it percolates into the aquifer, the fact that we have 10 times more falling on us than we actually use, and maybe 20 times if we could get rid of the 50% non-revenue water. The question becomes, so how does it get into this aquifer in order for the Barbados Water Authority to then sell it back to us? It gets there through natural methods. But many, many years ago, hundreds ago, long before our time, Mr. President, we figured out that we needed to dig suck wells. Because when we dug these suck wells, and we strategically placed them, and we cleared areas so that it would drain into that area, we put the water back into the aquifer. And that aquifer, again, I am not an engineer, Mr. President, but I am told that the aquifer is really a layer of fresh water, lens they call it, sitting upon some brackish water and then some salt water. And it is constantly flowing into the sea. Now, Mr. President, I know that to be true, as I think many of my honourable senators in here know it to be true as well, because there are many beaches in Barbados that as a child, we sat there and we dug, and after a while, we had some cold water coming up on our hand. So, well, what is that? And your father, your grandfather, your grandmother, or someone would tell you, that's fresh water flowing under, and it's just flowing out. And that's a very, very important geological phenomenon that we have, that we are so lucky in Barbados that we can have 1.4 trillion gallons of water falling on our island and constantly flowing out to the sea because it's keeping the seawater back from coming into our aquifer. But it first has to get into the aquifer. And this is where I am taking you, Mr. President, as we are talking about the stream that we're talking about at Three Houses and the ponds. That is where the aquifer has come to the surface. It is now flowing freely for us to use it in very few places in Barbados, as you heard from the United Nations report. The challenge that we have then is that we actually need to harvest more of this water. We don't have a water scarcity problem from the point of view of physical water. We have 10 to 20 times more water falling on Barbados than we actually use. Huge capacity for growth. There are many other countries in the world who are, in fact, water scarce physically. They can't do anything about it. There's no rain. Nothing falls there. We have an economic scarcity, Mr. President, that we need to address. And in some ways, this bill before us is touching on some of that economic scarcity, some of that economic fairness to all to use it. But we need to harvest more water, and we need to store more water, and we need to focus on this. Mr. President, I want to give you another statistic which I was surprised, disappointed, maybe, but very surprised to find. I mentioned earlier that we pump, the BWA pumps 40 million gallons per day. Mr. President, it might come as a surprise to you to find out, as it did to me, that the total reservoir capacity in Barbados today is 40 million gallons. 1 day's supply of water. So we don't actually have a reservoir. Let's be clear. You have a throughput, because the entire storage that you have is 1 day's storage, and that 1 day's storage is distributed that day. Unfortunately, 50% of it is non-revenue water, I'll use that term. So we have, secondly, a storage issue. Thirdly, there is some other matters to be discussed at another time to do with water reuse, and I won't touch on them at this point in time. But I would like to talk specifically and make some recommendations as I conclude on the idea of harvesting and storing more. Many years ago, in a different capacity, I wrote about the public service that agriculture plantations do for us as Barbadians in having working, clean suck wells. And there was, and I believe it is still on the books within the agriculture side of our government, for a subsidy for suck wells on agricultural land. I think we need to move very quickly, Mr. President, towards recognizing that this service that is being done by those who have suck wells, which are maintained on their property, and is supplying our aquifer such that the BWA can then pump it and sell it back to us, they should be paid for keeping those wells in good condition. We should inspect those wells. We should know where they are. And if we did it well, we are not a water-scarce country. We badly manage what God gives us from the sky. God gives us 10 to 20 times more than we need. But because our plantations, our agriculture division, our agriculture industry in Barbados has been on its knees for more than 20 years, they don't clean the suck wells. They can't afford to do it. They don't debush the areas leading to it. We as a community block it with all kinds of things that we shouldn't be blocking them with. We need to aggressively move back, look at those suck wells, identify where they are, and pay the landowner who is maintaining, creating a suck well that is giving us back that water, which eventually in the aquifer, Mr. President, will then come up to the surface in places like Three Houses and be able to continue to provide an income for so many people. So, Mr. President, we'd like to just conclude by saying one last thing. It's strange for me that in Barbados, as the rain comes across the Atlantic Ocean, and I often tell visitors to this island that we have some of the purest, cleanest air in the world as it comes across the Atlantic and it is purified, and we go to the east and southeast coast and we breathe in deeply that salt air and we feel great. It's strange because apparently the rain that falls in Barbados, Mr. President, is not good enough for us to keep and use. But when it falls in St. Vincent and Bequia, or even in Antigua, it can go straight into a cistern and it can be used. So I believe that there is going to be, I'm understanding there's going to be some perhaps future discussion on matters like this. But we need to be very, very clear on this. The same rain that falls here falls in these other places. And I have had the pleasure to be in a place like Bequia that does not have anything other than the rain that falls upon your roof for you to use. I travel a lot, thank you. Thank you. So I'm hopeful that I stand in support of this bill. I think it is heading in the right direction. I think there is a wider issue of water usage in Barbados that we need to address. And I'm suggesting to those who are hearing that the service that is done for us by the agricultural land owners, small, large, and otherwise, when they put strategic wells, suck wells, that replace the water into the aquifer, it does not flow into the ocean, it does not erode our land, it percolates through that coral stone, it resupplies the aquifer that allows us to keep the brackish water out and then allows us as a people to enjoy what God brings to us from heaven. So I encourage those to be looked at in other areas. And with those few words, I'm obliged to you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Malou. Senator Dr. Brathwaite.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me, and I would like to say good afternoon to my fellow senators. Very pleased to be here today. Mr. President, I would like to associate myself with the comments that have just been expressed by my fellow Senator Malou, Senator Andrew Malou. I remember some time ago in this chamber, I made the comment that, in my opinion, Barbados is not a water-scarce country. And there were those who expressed consternation and surprise that I could express such an opinion. I felt at that time, and I still feel now, that our water resources are not managed in the way they could be, that they could be better managed, to respond to the water needs of the nation in terms of the needs for water for industry, water for domestic use, water for agriculture, water for all the variety of issues which need to be addressed in a modern society. And I support the comments made by Senator Malou because they strike at a very important issue which we have to consider in our nation, the management of our natural resources. The management of our natural resources, not only in the context of today, but the management of our resources for future and for future generations. One of the things that is clear to me, and I have congratulated the government on more than one occasion for the tremendous efforts that are being made to modernize the agricultural sector. And that modernization is fundamental to us moving forward as a country in our attempts to feed our people. And one of the critical things about moving forward with the new agriculture is that the new agriculture cannot be rain-fed. We are going to need irrigation facilities that provide water in the times when there is no rain. The crop that we have got to know is very, I would say, consistent with our pattern of rainfall. We get the rains when the crop is planted and when it's growing, the sugar cane I'm talking about, and when the time for harvest comes, we have the dry season. It's very convenient. It's a very convenient crop. But, Mr. President, that cannot apply to the production of food crops that have to be supplied with water continuously during their growth and development. And so, water management is not only going to be important for the new agriculture which we are proposing, it's going to be important for the new housing that we are proposing, it's going to be important for the new industries that we are proposing. Water is going to be critical for our future development. Because of that, Mr. President, I am very pleased to see that government is considering and preparing and proposing legislation to deal with the question of water management, water quality, water distribution, etc. Water rights, like land rights, tend to be one of the most controversial topics anywhere in the world. And therefore, having the government take a proactive stance in this particular case to seek to develop an equitable solution to the distribution of water between domestic use and agricultural use is a step in the right direction. I believe that the agriculture that we are proposing in order to feed this nation, its success will depend on better management of our water supplies to ensure that during those dry periods of the year, we have sufficient water to keep our crops growing. And if we are going to be effective in supplying those food needs, we must be consistent in supply. You cannot have a hotel manager who signs a contract with a farmer to provide food for his hotel, and then the farmer says to the hotel manager, well, look, we didn't have any rain, so I really can't supply tomatoes today. It can't work like that. There has to be consistency of supply. And if there's going to be consistency of supply, there has to be consistency of water. And this is where water storage and water harvesting now becomes critical. If we don't do that, you cannot have a modern agricultural sector, and therefore you cannot feed the nation. And so, the bill that is before us today, in my view, as I mentioned, is a step in the right direction because it treats with the controversy that could arise between competing interests in a community between water for domestic use and water for agriculture. Having the BADMC establish a framework and a mechanism for resolving these conflicts and putting in place appropriate mechanisms to treat with those who seek to exploit advantages that may not be adequate or appropriate for them is a step in the right direction. Whether we promote precision agriculture, vertical farming, aquaponics, hydroponics, no matter what kind of agriculture we promote, water is going to be fundamental to our success. So the management of water resources is important for our future. I'm pleased to see that this piece of legislation seeks to give priority to water for agriculture, where the views of the farmers have been taken into consideration. It is my hope that the legislation will address a historic problem and that this mechanism will be used in other areas of conflict and that the BADMC will proceed with haste to implement this legislation to ensure that the water supply in that particular area is managed in the interest of all. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. Speakers, Senator Hayward.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me and allowing me the opportunity to speak on this very important bill. But before I begin, sir, let me acknowledge that I find it quite interesting remarks from all of the other senators that contributed, and I will definitely touch base with them with respect to some responses that I did not think it was misleading, but may necessarily skew the discussion with respect to the provisions that the government have made with this bill. Sir, let me begin by saying that I find absolutely no pleasure in prefacing my contribution with a slight distraction with regards to a very unsettling situation that occurred a few days ago within the region, and in particular Guyana, sir. However, I find it almost to be an obligation of mine to join in solidarity with others across the region and our very own Prime Minister to extend prayers to the families and others affected by the tragic fire which took the lives of dozens of young people, 19 young people, sorry. And this is from the town hall Madia. I had the pleasure, sir, of going to this place roughly 3 years ago, 7 hours drive from Georgetown. And it is well known for its exploits in terms of minerals. Gold in particular is really a gold town, that's what they call it. And I had the opportunity to actually visit the school as well a few years ago. And one of the well-known persons, Mr. Roger Hines, who owns Hines Supermarket in Madia. And it is a very tragic situation, sir. I wish to associate myself with all of those persons who expressed condolences. And on behalf of my family and I, and certainly and appropriately, on behalf of all Barbadians, I wish to extend condolences to the families, the friends, and all persons who are affected as an individual, and even more compoundingly so as a father, sir. My prayers be with the people of Guyana. Sir, on the surface, it would not surprise me if most saw this bill as an agricultural bill or a bill that focused on food security. Nothing wrong with that, sir. If persons saw it as a water security bill or a water insecurity bill, there's nothing wrong with that as well. But today I believe that this bill represents something that defines the framework of Barbados going forward in terms of how it deals with issues in a participatory manner. It represents, sir, to me, a framework that speaks to the very social fabric, not only of Tree Houses, but of Barbados with respect to developing cohesion and identifying synergies where apparent conflicts may exist, sir. Sir, I would not be offended by those perspectives, but while it is true, I just want to reflect on the greater detail of the work that has been undertaken by the BADMC and the Ministry of Agriculture and the Minister of Agriculture, sir, in ensuring that all inputs from all of the key and relevant stakeholders, riparian owners, as well as the persons who may not necessarily be owners, but they're persons who were in these stakeholder meetings who access the spring as well, and for various purposes that do not have an equitable or legally equitable interest in the spring. I don't own the land that the spring runs on, yeah? Sir, the bill represents, in part, a commitment on the government to engage, to re-engage all of these stakeholders on matters that can have severe consequences on our country within the context of the same water scarcity, food security, and as I just mentioned, the very social fabric. Sir, I want to really say that at the center of this complex bill, and I say complexity because wherever persons are asked to come together to decide on something that may take away or redirect rights to access to anything that is claimed by other individuals or a group of individuals, there's always complexity. And where there's complexity and individuals involved, there's almost always conflict, sir. Sir, conflict over the right to access water within the context of other stakeholders wanting to exercise or impose that very right. Sir, when, for example, we look very far to the east and we look at, it is called the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, supposed to be the largest hydroelectrical dam in Africa, up to 5,000 megawatts. Thumbs up to the Ethiopians. Down the Nile River, we have Egypt. And the Egyptians, through their ministry, their governments, are absolutely upset about this development, not because they do not want the Ethiopians, from my interpretation, to enjoy the benefits of the hydroelectricity, but the practicality of that dam means that it has to be filled to generate electricity. And if it has to be filled, it means that those persons downstream may have to be affected in terms of reduced flows of water coming to them along the Nile River. And that is the politics of a different region, sir, so I don't want to go any deeper, but the meat of the matter on that point is that where there are people and where there's development along a collective or shared resource such as water, there's always bound to be conflict, sir. In other countries, these conflicts go further than just talk. It can be deadly. People fight, people go to war. In some East Africa countries that I've had the pleasure of visiting recently, people literally run farmers off of their lands because of water scarcity, sir. And these conflicts are exercised over withdrawals from the spring or the particular rivers, conflicts over the diversions along different points of the rivers, and conflicts over trespassing and restricted access to traditional access points along the course, sir. So this bill also represents a participatory process where many meetings were held. Many meetings were held with the stakeholders, not only to meet and see them, but to hear what their concerns were, sir, to document their concerns, sir. And this bill is a representation of those concerns and a representation of a process and an approach that is useful for the progression of that particular area. So behind all the technical aspects of the bill, that is offering the guidance and regulation to those who can access water, the location and what they can use, sir, it is really a bill that unintentionally or intentionally maintains the peace amongst the many stakeholders with an equitable interest in this particular area. Sir, there's an agreement with the unrestricted access of the BLDMC, and this is an agreement for them to come onto the properties should there be any, come onto the properties on a regular basis or as they see fit to assess the developments on the properties to ensure that it is not affecting the access or affecting other persons along the stream as well. And this may come by way of having a disproportionate effect along the stream. But sir, one other aspect I want to speak to is the emergency measures, sir. The general area, I was given a bit of history no less than 20 minutes ago about the general area being an open pond, a big pond in the past. And as such, the likelihood of flooding occurring is relatively high. It was a big pond, and naturally, the water will want to go out to the traditional pathways. And also, sir, I was given a bit of history in terms of, some aspects of liability and discussions around farmers and stuff as well. And I left that discussion with the confidence that there is an understanding amongst parties that this is perhaps one of the better aspects of this particular bill or components of this bill with regards to ensuring, sir, that past circumstances do not recur. And these are circumstances, sir, where flooding occurred before, and each individual stakeholder would take their own individual initiative to divert water in instances of flooding, uncoordinated, sometimes leading to conflict, and what one person upstream or downstream think that they're doing to protect their property was really affecting properties further downstream as well, sir. And what this bill has done via this emergency measure, this particular clause 5, is that they recognize that there needs to be a more coordinated effort in these particular circumstances, sir. It recognizes that if we leave Tom Brown and James and whoever else, sir, to set about their own mitigation effort, then the general integrity of the spring itself would be under threat. The general integrity and the general livelihoods of farmers who would access the spring, sir, would be, in effect, put in jeopardy. So, sir, we also have a continuation of the engagement with the stakeholders, not ending after the initial consultations, but we recognize it through the Oversight Committee, a combination of the Barbados Water Authority, quite correctly, quite appropriately, also the riparian owners and the BADMC, sir, to ensure that the feedback loop, that there is a feedback loop, that the conversation doesn't end, and that there's continuous engagement. I encourage those persons with an interest to engage the Water Authority and to engage the BADMC as the entity that is going to basically have oversight for this particular bill. So, sir, a lot has been said. I would like to clarify for the record, or would like to ask further consideration when we make statements with regards to water scarcity in Barbados. I definitely associate myself with the need for continuous harvesting, but I also recognize in terms of the definition of water scarcity, whether it be economic scarcity or one focused more on the physical constructs of water actually being scarce, that the Met Office has published from time to time statements with regard to the fall in precipitation, annual precipitation from time to time. And all data, without having tables before me, shows that regardless of us producing 10 times or 20 times the amount of water, regardless of there being 10 and 20 times the amount of water coming into the island via the rain, relative to what is distributed through the BWA system, there's less and less water every year, and it is expected to get even worse, sir. That is the general notion, yeah? So with all the harvesting, which I cannot disagree with, I just want the public to know that we are a water scarce country. We're becoming even more water scarce. And we also welcome, within that context, all efforts to continuously harvest what we have, even if what we have is decreasing. So, sir, I don't want to get too deep into other aspects of agriculture. I believe that all persons here are in full agreement with regards to the intentions of this bill, the intentions of the BADMC, the intentions of setting up a management infrastructure, and all are also in agreement, to my understanding, sir, of the intentions of even the emergency measures with respect to this bill, and which is non-contentious. So, sir, with those few words, I want to associate myself with this bill. I want to ensure that the public and all other members are aware of the intentions as well. And I want to ensure that we move forward in a very collective manner, recognizing the need to do this bill, as Senator Bradford mentioned, in as expedient a manner as possible, given what is at stake, sir. So with those few words, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Herod. Senator Miller.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe that I too can be brief, Mr. President. Mr. President, some time ago in this honorable chamber during this session of Parliament, I believe I brought a document with me and I said that I would like to make it a document of the House. It is a document, sir, that bears what some would like to believe are secrets, but they're no secrets in print. The document is available on the internet, and it clarifies some of the statements and some of the beliefs that were made about water wells in this country. And so I'll repeat what the document is. The document is called the British Union Oil Company Survey. The British Union Oil Company Limited Survey. It is from March 1946. And the author is a geologist, a famous British geologist. And his works are in the Swedish archives. His name is Alfred Sen. It's the most comprehensive document published on all the existing water wells in Barbados that had windmills and other things on them. If you compare the number of wells that existed then as water wells and the number that are known to exist now, they are less than 40%. So I have asked what has happened to the rest. Wells don't disappear. I am afraid to think of what is being put into such wells, unless they're all capped. So I'll go no further than that. I have passed the document on to a number of persons who promised they will duly look into it. It's a very comprehensive document, and this document, sir, is a world-renowned piece of work by this geologist. Sir, I want to say, promise made, promise kept. Some years ago, sir, when the controversies raged in River Plantation about access to water, the Honourable Prime Minister took it upon herself with a party to go on site and see some of the issues, and she promised at the time that appropriate action would be taken. And the fact that we are standing here today in this chamber, debating this bill, confirms that we've come to the final position. I, sir, as a Barbadian, am proud of that. But, Mr. President, the word equitable has been thrown around, and sometimes equitable is confused with equality. They're different things, totally different things. The lawyers whom I speak to tell me that equity refers to fairness and justice. It does not mean that there's even treatment. It means there's fair treatment. And this bill, sir, is really a water rights bill. No one, I shouldn't say that. I have not heard anyone previously say that it's a water rights bill, but it's really a water rights bill. And everything about it says that it is. It probably will set the trend for what will happen in this country with water rights. Now, the bill refers to riparian rights, which, as a republic, we're talking about English common law rights, and it respects the riparian rights not only of the original owners, but with title that can be passed on. That's a big step. That's a huge step, Mr. President. To my mind, what it means is that it does not clarify who really owns the water. It says who controls it, but it does not clarify who owns the surface water. And while it solves some of the issues of the farmers and all those who use the water at River Plantation, we now have, as a country, to look at what happens to all the other surface water in the gullies and in the streams, some larger than a river, and some larger than 3 houses, sorry, and what we will do about them, because there were only 2 springs that were regulated with acts. The others were unregulated. Now, Mr. President, Senator Herwood spoke about the role of the BADMC and its functions as defined in this bill. I am worried about the word shall. I'm told by lawyers that shall does not necessarily mean shall as the layperson sees it. So I would like to have some explanation as if shall defines what your functions are or what you should do if you are not obligated to do it. And I refer, sir, to two things mentioned in section 5.1 and 5.2. It speaks to testing of water, because the assumption is since the BADMC has now taken on the responsibility for the spring, and it has management functions from clearing the spring down to testing the water, who will be aware and made aware of these tests? And what is the current status of this water? Because for the first time, this spring is now regulated almost like our potable water. So if the water is tested and it is found to be contaminated, will we be told? Because this water is now defined for agricultural use. But on the other hand, there are recreational activities that are allowed within the same bill that will contaminate water. I do not have to say what they are, but they've been going on for a long time, so we don't know what the real status of the water is. So when the water is finally tested, will they let us know what the status is? And secondly, do these responsibilities place the BADMC in a place where it becomes liable for acts of nature? There is a part that speaks to flooding and the requirement to divert water into wells. I think they're on the southern side, I've seen them, of Brown's Pond. And the language that I saw, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm a doctor, worries me because it looks as though if I was a farmer and somebody is responsible not only for distribution of the water, but for maintaining flood control. And my crops get flooded out and I lose them. Will I be able to take legal action against you for not doing what you're supposed to do? It takes on, to my mind, a much broader aspect than just supplying water. It says that now you are responsible for mitigating flood control. And as I said earlier, Brown's Pond was a nice place, not Brown's Pond, River was a nice place to occasionally go and shoot ducks, migratory ducks. Because when it floods, it's a lake. The entire thing becomes submerged. And there's no doubt, unless in our lifetime, sir, the rain stops falling and in the way it comes and surprises us, at some point in time, again, river will flood. And who will take legal responsibility for all the damage that will occur to livestock and crops? I would just like that clarified, whether this bill, soon to become an act, places any particular liability on government. And sir, the bill speaks in the interpretation about pollution, and it is meant to stop persons from genuinely polluting the water source by any means. But sir, these things, sir, are only relevant if you enforce them. So if we have a situation where we know a source of pollution that is new or existing, and we do not do anything about it, then we are wasting time. So, sir, I would not only like to see the legislation pass and all the benefits that would accrue to farmers happen, but I would like to have, sir, enforcement. And I would really like clarification, sir, about whether the BADMC will be genuinely responsible for flood mitigation. It's a big responsibility. It's a huge responsibility, sir. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nader. Senator Nurse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I shan't be very long because quite a lot of what I had pondered on have already been articulated by the senators who spoke before me. So no need to regurgitate it. But I just want, first of all, to congratulate the department, government department responsible, Ministry of Agriculture, for bringing this bit of legislation to Parliament. I think it is key. It is what I suppose you can refer to as parochial, in that it deals with a particular, area that is affected by this issue. But of course, when we begin to consider what it is all about, we realize that in a broader sense, we really need to be looking at the overall management of our water resources. And I don't know that, I don't know if there's a policy paper. I don't know if there's anything in any of the government departments or otherwise which sets out some policy on how we look forward to managing our water resources. We recognize that they are scarce resources. And I say scarce in inverted commas because the senators Braffett and Malalu suggested that really and truly we are not a water scarce country. But the fact of the matter is that over the past couple of years, almost every year, we have had the complaints of the farmers. We've had the complaints of the residents in various areas of the country because of the lack of available water on a consistent basis every day. So that needs to be something which occupies our attention in a broader way, in a much broader way than currently this piece of legislation will allow us to do. But nevertheless, I am glad to see that this legislation is in place, and hopefully the operation of this legislation will result in some relief being brought to the farmers in that area. And only recently, in the local press, we have seen where farmers had actually brought this issue to the attention of the public via the press. And so the question is, like a lot of other legislation, are we going to allow it to hopefully, having passed through Parliament, to languish and not be implemented to the benefit of those farmers in the area? You see, I raise that because we have a lot of legislation, Mr. President, which is on our books, but a lot of it sits there and it is not enforced for all the various reasons which can be identified. But if we don't make sure that we follow up on this particular issue, then our farmers who we are dependent upon to help us to increase our food production and to help us to guarantee that food security to which we have been speaking almost since the beginning of this particular session of Parliament, and we've been recognizing the importance of food security, then this passing of this legislation is going to be to no avail. And so the management is really key. And I'm not here going to knock on any particular agency, but truth be told, the agency that is assigned to manage this particular matter has not been the most highly performing, put it that way, of government entities. And so I don't want to hear that we couldn't do what we were supposed to do because we weren't allocated sufficient or adequate resources, that in terms of finances or in terms of personnel, to deal with this issue. As Senator Maynard said, this is a big issue, much bigger than I think we realize. To be able to maintain that the river, the stream, in a pristine manner, to make sure that we maintain it clean and provide good water for the farmers in the area. And, you know, there are some other spin-offs which I see can happen from here. I could see that if we have a properly managed, properly maintained stream, you will probably find that fish, for example, then starts to inhabit the waters. The birds, for example, will obviously come in once the fish are there. We have the opportunities to, you know, maybe provide another opportunity for hiking along the banks of the stream, and perhaps another opportunity for another tourist attraction. So I see these as spin-offs which can happen if the management takes place in the manner in which the Act intends, that it is properly maintained, and that, of course, the main aspect, which is to ensure an equitable sharing of the water from the stream, is done. And so, Mr. President, with those few words, I just want to congratulate the Ministry of Agriculture for coming forward with this bit of legislation. I didn't even realize that the previous act, as Senator Cummings suggested, was probably like over 200 years. So, I mean, without even looking at it, we know that it needed to be updated. So, again, I congratulate the government, and I trust that it will help to redound to the benefit of the farmers in the area. I am obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. Any further speakers? Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I want to begin, as usual, by expressing my appreciation for the comments of the honourable senators who have spoken. I do not take for granted that it is a lot of responsibility to sit in this honourable chamber, Mr. President, and to prepare for the items of legislation that come before this chamber, to be able to represent the interests of the people of Barbados. And so the extensive conversation that we have had must have been preceded by extensive preparation for your presentation, and I take it not for granted. I just want to express my appreciation to all of the honourable members who have spoken. Now, I want to specifically speak to just two issues that were raised in the comments made by other members. Yes, It is an agricultural bill. Yes, it is a water bill. Yes, it is a people empowerment bill. Yes, it is an enfranchisement bill. Yes, it is about social cohesion. Yes, it is about engagement with people. Yes, it is a promise made and a promise kept, Mr. President, by this government. And we are very happy to have been able, again, to represent the interests of the people. And in so doing, Mr. President, I want to just make the point that when we speak about social cohesion and we speak about the interaction between legislation and social cohesion and social norms and culture, it is important for us to then speak about, as was raised by Senator Nurse, the importance of enforcement. And this is the work that occupies the extension officers who are there and now empowered by order number 3 on the order paper, Mr. President, to go into the community, go into the area, to police the spring, to engage with the riparian owners, to be able to follow all the way down to Browns Pond, that which is happening in the area. Mr. President, there is a point being raised also about what happens in the event of flooding. There is, in instances, Mr. President, the mechanism of the Agricultural Development Fund, and in instances where there can be found to be a case for compensation or support of any kind, that case can be made before the members of the committee, who then in turn can and have done on more than one occasion refer that to the Agricultural Development Fund, and a decision is taken therein. But there is no automaticity based on what is written in the legislation and the mechanism that is in place. So I just wanted to respond specifically to those things and to express my appreciation for the substantive comments that were made. Now, Mr. President, this is a matter that I am certain will continue to be opined on by the Minister with responsibility for agriculture in due course, because as I said before in my own presentation, he is going to be speaking and has already begun to speak with his ministry, or to the nation along with his ministry, about the phases of this project, including phase 2, which is imminent. And so I am confident that many of the issues that have been raised here will be dealt with by the Ministry of Agriculture. Finally, Mr. President, I'm not going to get into the question of whether we are water scarce or if we're not water scarce, because I believe that there is a body of work that has been done in a contemporary era by the ministry with responsibility for transport and works that has looked at what our rainfall has been, what our aquifers are producing, what our water reuse policy may need to be, and what it now needs to be, and how we are engaging in water harvesting. And those things, Mr. President, I believe I've said on more than one occasion that I've learned, certainly in public life, many things, but one of those things is that A plus B plus C is only good if it is divided by time, because circumstances may change, and a time series analysis, as I understand it, over how we are treating to rainfall and what our rainfall patterns have been over time has been the subject of a body of work by the ministry with responsibility for water, but I will leave that to another discussion at another time. And so with these very few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. And the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into committee of the whole for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate dissolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that Clause 1 do not stand part.
Since this is a cognate debate, would the clerk please specify which of the two we are dealing with?
Madam Deputy President, we are still on order number 2.
Thank you. Leader of Government Business.
So, Madam President, I beg to move that, okay, no, you. I beg to move that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 of order 2 do now stand part. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. All those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 2 do not stand part.
The question is that clause 2 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 3 do not stand part.
The question is that clause 3 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye, and those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 4 do not stand part.
The question is that clause 4 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 5.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 5 do not stand part.
The question is that clause 5 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye. Aye. Those against please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 6.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 6 do not stand part.
The question is that clause 6 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye?
Aye.
Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 7.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 7 stand part.
The question is that clause 7 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Clause 8.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 8 stand part.
The question is that all honourable senators in favour do now say aye. Aye. And those against do now say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 9.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 9 stand part.
The question is that clause 9 do now stand part. Would all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 10.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 10 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 10 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 11.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 11 stand part.
The question is that clause 11 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 12 stand part.
The question is that clause 12 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 13.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 13 do no stand part.
The question is that clause 13 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 14.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 14 stand part.
The question is that clause 14 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 15.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 15 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 15 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 16 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 16 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The first schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be the schedule to the bill. Will the honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Will the honourable senators against please say no? The ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Will all honourable senators against please say no? The ayes have it.
Third schedule.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that the third schedule be the third schedule to the bill.
The question is that the third schedule be the schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And all honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this act do now pass, this bill do now pass, and be cited as the Three Houses Spring Management and Control Act 2023.
The question is that the Three Houses Spring Management and Control Act 2023 do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. This act is therefore now passed and so cited.
Order number 3, sir. Order number 3, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation Amendment Bill 2023.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into a committee of the whole for further deliberation on this bill. I beg to move this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill, that is the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation Amendment Bill, be read a second time. All the senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into further deliberation on this bill, into committee for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Just two clauses. Clause 1.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 1 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 1 do now stand part. All those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 2 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Report.
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do not report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And all honourable senators against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation Amendment Act of 2023.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Barbados Agricultural Development and Marketing Corporation Amendment Act 2023. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. This bill is therefore now passed and so cited. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the suspension of this sitting of the Senate for lunch for us to resume at 10 minutes after 3 in the afternoon.
The question is that this sitting be suspended until 3:10 p.m. today. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Meeting the ayes have it. This sitting is therefore suspended until 3:10 p.m. today.